Today's project is to build a diesel tank from aluminium. This will be mounted on the back of a camper to supply the diesel heater. I've been supplied the plans and all the bits and pieces as well, like the fuel outlet and the fuel breather, etc. And I'm using 3mm aluminium plate. There are a few things I need to do before constructing the actual tank, like the sight gauge and a little adapter for the air breather on the top of the tank. And this I'll just make out of a bit of aluminium, turn it up on the lathe. My little lathe has been so handy for doing this sort of job. Only took a few minutes to do this. Yep, that'll be fine. I can part it off and now I can weld it into the appropriate place. You can see that I've got a lip so that I can weld it from the inside. But I'm also going to make a little baffle so there's no chance of fuel surging up through that breather hole. So this little baffle will just have a little plate here with some gap around it. And once I've welded it in, then be able to cut that off and weld it over the top of the hole inside. As you can see, the air will come up through those gaps. And here it is cut off. And once it's welded on the inside of the tank, you can see that the surge, if there's any surge, it won't go straight up that little hole. And while I'm doing this, I need to confess that I'm only a hobby welder, and this is for my brother-in-law's camper. So all care and no responsibility. But with his help, we did construct the whole of the chassis out of aluminium, and that's been a success. Okay, that little part's done. Time for the fuel outlet, and the fuel outlet needs to be a right angle so that it comes out the bottom of the back on an angle. So again, I've just made a couple of parts on the lathe and I'll weld them together. This is a little bit fiddly, as you can see, it's quite small, but we do get success in the end. As you can see, one end is built for the fuel hose to go onto, that'll be clamped in place, and the other end is just to go into the aluminium so that I can weld it from the inside. While welding it just on the inside theoretically should be fine, I did end up welding it on the outside as well, just to be sure. Anyway, with those bits done, I can now start tacking up the tank itself. Of course, the initial fit up and tacking is the most important part of this whole job. Once it's all tacked in place, welding all the seams just becomes a mechanical process. The process that I've found that works best for a box is to just tack one side and then do the end. That way the whole thing is squared up without any problem. Because I'm a hobby welder, I've got an excuse. These welds are not perfect, but fortunately they'll be dressed. Because the plan is to paint this tank black. Well, the fill-and-neck's next, and I made a complete botch up of this. Anyone would be able to see that this hole saw is certainly not going to be deep enough to drill right down for the hole for the neck. But I didn't realise it until about now. So I had to completely mongrelise the hole with an angle grinder, and I didn't get it anywhere near right. Sort of got it right at the top, but there's a huge gaping gap at the bottom. So as you can see, it looks good from this angle. But it's off to the bandsaw to start cutting out some small bits to fill in holes, because there's a gaping gap that's got to be filled. Fortunately, this is achievable, and with a bit of effort, it doesn't look too bad. So with the filler done, I can now start just welding up all of the seams that have been tacked. The seams are tacked edge to edge, so there's a nice big crevice to melt the weld down into. When any metal heats, it warps, and so I'm doing a line of weld, and then I'll turn it around and do a line on the other end, etc. This hopefully avoids any warpage. Again, you can see that this is not a display weld, but as I said, they'll be dressed. And I'm going to use a 40 grit flap disc for that job. I'm finishing off with 120 grit on a random orbital sander. This enables me to sand out the 40 grit scratches and also sand off all of the shiny surface of the aluminium, so we get a good bond for the paint. The diesel heater pump is going to be mounted on the back of the tank, and so I need to put a 10mm thick piece of aluminium on the back, and I'm just tapping a thread into that so that the heater can be bolted into it. Fortunately, I had a piece of scrap just the right size for this job. And tapping the thread using the bench drill is a good way of making sure I get a nice straight cut. It's always a challenge welding really thick material to thinner material, but it turned out okay. And then welding a couple of tabs to bolt the whole tank onto the camper, and the last tab goes on the back, just using my little bender for this. Useful little tool. My brother made this bender for me and it's proved to be really handy. Alrighty then, it's time for the ultimate test. Does it hold water? And the answer is no, it doesn't. I've got a couple of pinholes. I've got one here on the filler neck, and I've got one here on the elbow of the sight glass. So once they're fixed up, fill the tank up again, and give it a bit of a pressure test by blowing into it. Sat it around for a few minutes, having a bit of a look. Bob's your uncle. So, one diesel heater tank finished for my brother-in-law's camper. It's been a fun build. The bits of plastic pipe you see will be replaced by the real thing. They were just to be able to hold the water while I did the check. Anyway, here's the back of the camper, and it sits right on top of the tow bar. Nice and neat, and when it's black, it'll disappear. Success. Happy with that.